Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, here we go with another episode where I have the fun time to talk with another accessibility practitioner. And today I'm speaking with Cam Beaudoin. Hello, Cam. How are you today?
Fantastic, Joe. How are you?
Oh, it's good. As usual, I'm in my home office on Vashon Island, Washington, which is near Blink's Seattle headquarters. Where are you talking to me from?
Yeah, I'm in Toronto, Canada, and I just came back from a week of vacation myself, camping in the outback. So I'm nice and relaxed for you here. It's great.
That sounds like a lot of fun. It's good to have the opportunity to chat with you, and certainly a lot of things that you've done that we could talk about. A good place to start is if you tell us a little bit about what your current work is all about.
Sure. I've got this nice dual opportunity right now. I'm currently senior manager of accessibility at one of the largest financial institutions in Canada, where I lead a team to help make sure that the organization as a whole follows accessibility guidelines and is trained up to really think of that shift left mentality. On the other side, on the flip side of the coin, I'm also a speaker. I'm a professional speaker for digital accessibility and disability inclusion. And that's what I do. I also run a weekly live show as well on LinkedIn too.
Well, so obviously you're really busy all the time. For the work that you're doing with the financial institution, what's that like? Kind of a day in the life or a week in the life for you in that activity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm gonna answer that in a way of it's not what I expected. And I'll tell you why, because it's a really important lesson that I think that a lot of us accessibility practitioners don't get to see a lot of, which is a management or leadership role who really cares about accessibility. And the reason I'm saying it's an interesting type of role is because I now have to tie accessibility in with business priorities and goals and key performance indicators, which I don't think is part of a lot of organizations, the fabric of their being just yet. So it's a really interesting role. I get to help out the entire organization, really set those metrics and set those goals, bring in tools and policies and decisions around the entire organization and make sure that they follow those rules that they said themselves that they would follow.
And you mentioned the show that you do in your speaking engagements. What does that consist of?
Yeah, so I've got a weekly LinkedIn live show where I try and bring on kind of just like this diverse guests and groups of people who have lived experiences with disabilities. I really find finding people who have those lived experiences, the voices, probably a key to our industry, really making sure that understanding and hearing about how people live with disabilities is a really good way to understand and appreciate how I can cater to them and how I can help out, this group of individuals. And beside that, I'm also pretty actively going after events, keynote talks, other organizations, whoever's looking to make that transformational change in their organization to start caring about accessibility or continue on their journey, or even get their staff of accessibility professionals trained up on how to speak about accessibility properly. Those are the types of markets that I'm really getting heavily into and speaking at those organizations as well.
Well, we'll make sure we get notes about those activities in the show notes. But one of the things I like to do in this program is find out how people made their way to where they are today and live life and work life. And so, why don't you just pick a spot where you'd like to start and let us know about how your journey progressed to what you're doing today?
Sure. It's always an interesting answer, isn't it, when you ask somebody, especially some of us advocates, right? Where you start. We all have this little bit different story, but it always relates in some kind of thing where I cared about a group of people. This is important to me, the better good of the world. And I started off as a developer, and I just wanted to make good code. And we were waiting for a project that we were working on. It was waiting for logins. You know, banks sometimes are hesitant about giving logins to people before a 6-week kind of introduction and an onboarding session, things like that. So at the consulting firm I worked at, we were waiting those 6 weeks, and I was a good developer, still junior, and they threw the web content accessibility guidelines at me. They said, Cam, go learn this. You know, you're going to be the accessibility guy. And I read them as a junior and looking forward to this. And I read them top to bottom, which is kind of what a lot of people in our industry do. And you realize that after 1.1.1, non-text content, and you move to the next one, you're like 1.2.1. Well, I don't have audio description here. Like, what do I need this for? So I started to realize that maybe wasn't the best way to approach it. We had a list of defects that need to be fixed. I burned those down. I finished those off. And after that, I became the accessibility subject matter expert. And one of the interesting stories that kind of came out of that was we were in a conversation to try and remember when mobile check deposit came out. Do you remember that? Like when you could take a picture with the check with your phone? And they were trying to decide do we need to integrate this to the iPhone 4 or do we just go forward with the iPhone 6? And the decision was, well, let's just continue forward with the iPhone 6 because let's not write code for an older model. And I thought that was kind of odd because I was thinking about the groups of individuals who maybe the only way they get paid is through a check. That's kind of unfortunate that they're not going to be able to afford or purchase a new telephone. Like, you tell me I got to buy a new smartphone just to be able to have a convenience of depositing a check. So I thought that was kind of wrong. And I started to just learn a little bit more about the industry. And I became the subject matter expert for the organization in Canada about that. I went to CSUN, the conference around accessibility. I spoke at CSUN in 2018, sent there by the company. And since then, I've just started to speak more openly about digital and professional advocacy and how that kind of relates to this whole world, and how do we get others to care about this subject too, which is a really big focus of what I do now.
And the organization that you mentioned there early on, is that the one that you're still working with?
No, I actually left them. I had a manager from that organization tell me, and when I used to tell the story, people used to think it was bad or negative. Now, I used to think so as well, but it's changed a little bit over time. He said that, Cam, this company will never care about accessibility. And I had to take a step back because I thought that was very obtuse. I thought that was very confrontational of him to say that. A little bit later on, I learned that he used to do work on airport kiosks, also a very heavily regulated industry, right? Kiosks and airlines and stuff like that. And his job was overturned. Like he had no more job after working on these kiosks when everything was made remote and you could edit and change these kiosks remotely, whereas before you had to go in and plug a stick in and do a bunch of stuff. So he came from the regulatory industry. And when he told me that, I thought he was being, like I said, quite confrontational and saying, Cam, get out of here. You need something else. It wasn't until much later that, like I said, I realized that maybe he just wanted to test me and say, if you really care about accessibility, this company is not the one you should choose. You got to either go and find one who really does and continue that passion that way, or change roles within, because they'll never find or be able to sell projects of accessibility in this organization. So I left and I went to a pure accessibility consulting firm, and I was a technical lead there. And then I started my own company after that and started speaking.
Mm-hmm. And with the work that you do with you still work with a financial company?
Yep, financial
right?
institution. Yep.
And so how is that set up? Are you part of an overarching accessibility support for different parts of the organization, or do you work with individual departments or groups, or how is that set up?
Yeah, really interesting question, and I'm quite fortunate to be able to define what we're doing as we kind of do it. Recently, what happened was the organization had to change from a model where there's just, an accessibility team to let's go out and build an enterprise-wide accessibility like team or center of excellence or what have you. With large organizations, usually they have different names for different things, or there's a center of excellence over here for policies, and now do we create a second center of excellence, or do we call it something different. So to answer your question is anything that has to do with digital. So this means websites or the mobile app itself, or things like documents or PDFs and stuff, that all kind of falls under what me and my team consult on, and how we create the policies and procedures and decisions on how do we take this forward for the next 6 months, 1 year, and make decisions on these for that period of time to carry on kind of like as a permanent structure within the organization.
One of the things that you mentioned was your early work looking at the WCAG and kind of being overwhelmed by that, which I think is happens to a lot of people come into accessibility. Fortunately, we have a ton of great information, but in some ways it can be overwhelming to see all that. I like to people come in new. I like to just give them pieces that maybe are relevant, small chunks that are they can grab onto. But one of the things that a lot of large enterprise organizations like financial institutions have to deal with are government regulations. For me as a citizen in the United States, in working on projects, we're always involved with the Section 508 legalities, which stem from WCAG. What's it like in Canada in terms of the standards that you may need to comply with there?
Yeah, so recently, AOTA, which stands for the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, came into effect. There was a deadline in 2021. It was pushed 6 months, 2022, and then they said comply with WCAG 2.0 level AA, and that came into effect. And unfortunately, that AOTA did not have teeth into the rules. Like, they had, what was going to happen if someone did not comply? Well, they said they threatened for things up to $10,000 a day or something like that. And then it never really happened. So a lot of larger organizations or institutions did comply, because the rule was if you did business in the province of Ontario, you needed to follow the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Then people who were in other provinces, Quebec, British Columbia, the two other most populous provinces, said, well, I don't need to comply. I don't do business in Ontario, or my headquarters is in Quebec. That means I don't need to follow these guidelines. So recently what's happened is it's moved up to the federal level. The Accessible Canada Act is being now worked on, and they have a target deadline of 2040, which is a long term. So right now that's what we're working on. We're trying to figure out ways of how do we start to communicate the reasons for working on ACA now to larger organization, to the organization at large. And that presents its own challenges, right? Government moves slow, as we both know. And as the more regulated you get, the more difficult it is to actually enact those changes in a reasonable amount of time. And I love this challenge. This is something really interesting, because what you said earlier about breaking it down to smaller chunks is something I talk about a lot. Simplification is something we need to focus on in our industry, because it can get really, really complex and convoluted. How can I really describe the whole human condition in a few sentences on a website? You just can't do it. So that's why I don't even really say WCAG anymore. I say accessibility guidelines, because it's a lot easier for people to understand, or even better, the accessibility rules or rule set or things like that. Breaking things down into a really easily digestible, understandable piece of information is a lot easier than saying, WCAG 2.0 level AA success criteria 1.1.1. People just don't accept that as part of what they don't know what they're supposed to do with that, right? They say, okay, that's, what do I do? How is this practical? How do I make this work? So yeah, it's really important to make sure that we simplify and characterize what we're supposed to do in these really nice digestible chunks.
Well, you've been working in this area for quite a while. Do you have any thoughts, kind of looking to the future of things, where you see opportunities that you're excited about? Kind of on the other side of that, are there some areas where you're concerned that maybe there's not enough investment or progress being made?
Yeah, definitely. I see the biggest gap in our industry is the fact that we don't put, as individuals and professionals, enough focus on business reasons or speaking to business. One thing that I'm doing more and more now is tying in business goals with accessibility guidelines or rules. Now, what I mean by that is that there's companies out there who will post publicly on their blogs or on their diversity, equity, and inclusion pages on their websites. They say, we care about a diverse workforce. And yet we go in there as professionals and start to talk about, well, this is how you put alt text into an image. And we lose that tie between the business goals and disability inclusion. So that's where I see our biggest focus should be, is really talking to organizations. When we speak to organizations, I bring up their blog page on, hey, we just posted, last month about Pride Month, for example. Look at this post. It was great. This is a diverse, or here's a post that we just did on including non-gender bias in our hiring practices. Why aren't we talking about disability inclusion in that as well? And I think we need to get comfortable with that, because once we can start to tie business goals, business reasons into accessibility, targets and things like that, we're going to have a lot easier way of communicating with people who think in terms of key performance indicators and quarterly targets. And, I was just speaking to somebody about who wants to bring a design system, an accessible design system into his business. And he said, well, what are some ways that I can talk about this? And so like, just do that. Go look at the company's DEI goals and say, well, look, we care about bringing on new immigrants to our organization. Well, people with a second language really do benefit from language simplification or left alignment when they're reading text, because that's easier for how we consume information. Well, now all of a sudden I've tied in a business goal with accessibility reasons, and that means metrics can be put onto that. You can actually put a dollar figure on what's the value of that too. So I think our ability to communicate those business goals and becoming fluent with business language is something that we all need to work on. And I see that as a huge opportunity for us to move this forward in the next, 3 to 5 years.
One of the areas you mentioned briefly that you're involved with was in accessibility, or working for an organization as an accessibility consultant before you started your own work. For a lot of accessibility consulting, often it stems out of a company's fear of litigation and ends up and is often kind of the remediation post-development part, where you're really just trying to fix and put band-aids on what could be more significant problems. Have you noticed much progress in organizations doing more shift left and starting at the research and design level before things are coded? I kind of see it as a mixed bag, where there's still there's not as much investment early on, and it tends to be just trying to patch things at the end. But I was interested in kind of your experiences with that.
Well, sure. And I agree with you. I mean, that is left till the end. And a lot of consulting firms will, feed into that, right? There's some organizations out there who actively put ads out there saying, avoid accessibility litigation, call us now. But here's where I see that we fit in. It doesn't matter if you are a junior developer who cares a little bit about accessibility, or someone who's, been an advocate for years. We have to realize that it's all of our responsibility to educate clients and customers and companies and organizations on that shift left. So I think that we need to get comfortable, like I said, having those business conversations. Yes, I agree with you that shift left is important. But if I just go tell a UX research team, you should be interviewing people with disabilities, and then I walk out of the room or end the conversation without enabling them with the tools or the resources to be able to do that, well, then I'm not doing a very good job helping them shift left either. There's some great companies out there who have access to a pool of people who have lived experiences with disabilities and who are willing and able and getting paid to offer feedback on products and services. but we're not teaching about that. We're not going to talk to these teams and saying, hey, you can call this company, you can meet with their sales team, and you can do that. Instead, these, like a lot of consulting firms, they sit right in that tech level. They sit in that tech space, in that tech team, and say, well, just be that, pick up the phone and call me when you have a tech question. But we're not doing a lot of that work on, let's be the driving force before the shift left. It's not up to the business owners to shift left. It's up to us to drive that change. And we need to be in front of that.
Well, we cover a lot of things. I do want to ask you a little bit more about the show that you put on. What how often is that? Where can people find it? And we'll put that information in the show notes. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that's all about.
Sure, absolutely. So the name of the show is called Normalize It, where I talk about the things which a lot of people feel uncomfortable to talk about, right? I mean, no one wants to talk about neurodiversity in a workplace. What does it mean to go to work if you are autistic or you have ADHD? And like, what does that mean? So that's where that show name comes from. It's at noon on noon Eastern every Friday. I have like lots of guests coming on. I've got Mike Gifford coming on next week, and it's going to be a great show. That's going to be a more technical show, but this show really is for anybody who is curious and wants to know answers to some of those questions that are uncomfortable to ask in the workplace. How do you approach somebody who is deaf? How do you approach them when you walk up to them in the office? Do you go and shake their chair? Is that an appropriate way to reach out to them, or do you just lightly tap their shoulder? And by the way, it's lightly tap their shoulder. Don't go and shake anybody's chair. Nobody likes that. So I've got that every Friday. And now that I have a good 20 or 30 episodes, I'm going to start posting that on YouTube and also creating a podcast out of those episodes as well. I wanted a little bit of a backlog there before I did it, but join us live. I'm very interactive when I do the show. I answer comments and questions as I go, either to the guest or to me. I also do a solo Ask Me Anything episode once in a while that I'm driving as well. So yeah, come join me on LinkedIn. You just have to follow me there, and you just reach out, and I can let you know when the next one is.
Well, great. Well, thanks for letting us know about that. Definitely, it's a great thing to check out. And thank you so much for taking the time to share your background and your own journey with us. It was a pleasure to chat with you about this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Joe. I really appreciate it, and appreciate the work you do as well.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Yeah.